So welcome to City College. My name is Maggie Harrison, and I'm the chair of the Women's and Gender Studies Department at City College. And we are really excited to offer a new class for the first time in fall 2020, which is Women's and Gender Studies 35, Introduction to Masculinity Studies. So we had envisioned this session to happen a little differently when we planned it. We wanted to be together live, but we're really excited to be able to offer this opportunity to connect and to hear from Mauro. So I'm excited to introduce our new, we're building to introducing our new Women's and Gender Studies instructor, Mauro Osborne-Sifuentes. But before that, I wanted to give you just a brief context for where this course came from. So I want to turn it over to Adele, our Project Survive coordinator for that.
Hi, everybody. Nice to see you in the Zoom universe here. My name is Adele Fales-Carpenter, and I'm faculty in Women's and Gender Studies at City College. And I coordinate a program called Project Survive, which is driven by the leadership of students and is a sexual violence prevention and healthy relationship promotion peer education program. It's been around at the college for over 25 years now, which is really amazing. And there's a long legacy of leadership of men and masculine people in Project Survive. And we have seen increasingly in the last few years more interest from men and masculine identified people in stepping into leadership roles in Project Survive, and really in carving out space to have particular discussions about the stake and role of men and masculine people in thinking and rethinking gender and in work for gender justice, fueled by, the historical moment we're living in, Me Too, rising tides of activism against gender-based violence in Latin America, and I think, also some really clear connections between different kinds of reactionary social movements that we've seen in the U.S. since 2016 and their ties to sexism, and really also on the internet in particular. So I'm glad to be with all of you on the internet today, having a different kind of discussion, and really excited to turn it over to Mauro. But our hope with this course is really that we're helping build an accessible space to have those discussions that are centered on, but not only for men and masculine people within our broader Women's and Gender Studies department and community here at City. I'm going to just share a couple moderation notes for folks who haven't been in a Zoom webinar before. There's a mute function that you can turn off your sound. If you'd like to change your name or put your pronouns up, if you go to your own kind of picture, you can click the square with 3 dots and rename yourself there. And then there's a Q&A button that, if you're on the desktop, is at the bottom of your screen. You should be able to find it on mobile as well. And that's a place where throughout you can share questions that you have for Mauro or for any of the panelists and moderators here. And Mauro will do a dedicated question and answer time towards the second half of our gathering. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Adele. So now I want to formally introduce Mauro, and then he's going to introduce, add some informal comments. So Dr. Mauro Osborne-Sifuentes is a scholar and educator focused on multicultural LGBTQ+ pedagogy that has been developed in partnership with folks and communities of color, as well as immigrant and working class and indigenous communities. Past work in public schools, in universities, and in grassroots organizing with youth and adults inform Mauro's approach to teaching and ongoing learning. In past life, Mauro performed violin semi-professionally with the Bay Area Rainbow Symphony, and in a future life, Mauro will be crafting. Current non-teaching work includes collaboration with artists and activists on graphic novel and documentary film projects that explore histories of clinical violence against women, queer, and trans people in California. Mauro brings an interdisciplinary perspective from his education. He has undergraduate degrees in psychology and music. He has a master's in cultural anthropology, and his doctorate degree is in international and multicultural education with an emphasis in human rights education. We're thrilled to have Dr. Mauro Osborne-Sifuentes at City College. Welcome, Mauro.
Thank you so much. This is my first semester teaching a Intro to Gender and Women's Studies course here at CCSF, and it's been quite a first semester. I can say that much. I don't think anyone else. I haven't met anyone else who's sort of taught their first semester of community college under these kinds of circumstances. So, on the one hand, like, it's, obviously, like, I loved meeting with my students in person, so it's been definitely a shift to move to the online format, but I've been really just super grateful for, the generosity of, folks like Maggie and Adele sort of, and also my co-instructor, Lihia Lunston, for kind of holding my hand through this process. And, just been really humbled by how much support there's been, and how flexible the students have been as well. I think that, our students here at City College of San Francisco are, it's a unique set of learners in the world, people who are living lives that are diverse and complex and dynamic, and who have, made their best efforts to make this really rough transition to online. So, shout out to all the students out there who are, still foregrounding their education amidst all the other life responsibilities that they have. So, all of this stuff is in my mind as I kind of think about, like, who am I to teach this course, right? I'm sure there are lots of people who are qualified to do so. And so what I'd like to do right now is maybe share a little bit with you all about what's the kind of work that I've done that I think positions me well to speak to these things in maybe a way that they don't often get talked about. And then maybe what I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about sort of like the course, give an overview of what some of my hopes are for it, what are some of the themes that we're going to touch upon, what are some ways that we're going to get into all of that. And then I want to share with you all, some of my reflections from the film, The Mask You Live In. I'm sure that some of you were able to watch it, but if you weren't able to, I'll kind of just like pull out some of the big ideas in there that I hope are things that maybe we can dive into a little bit more deeply through other materials in the course. And then I really want to save the biggest chunk of time that we have, maybe, it's like a half an hour, for participant reflections on the film, for people to get their questions answered, whether they're just like nitty-gritty questions about the logistics of the course, like when it's happening, all the way up to like, how is this course going to help me either academically or in my community organizing work or in my process of like self-reflection and individual politicization. So I'd really love to get into those questions, but for now, I'll talk a little bit more about myself. So, you kind of got the academic rundown of things, but for the better part of the last decade, I have committed myself to the work of gendered and sexual violence prevention. I've worked alongside a lot of folks who are kind of like crisis intervention specialists, right? People who kind of like are helping folks who are in the thick of it, really going through a rough time, and who've, needed help, whether it's access to services or case management or therapy or supportive community. And I think that work is really, really important. The kind of work that I've tended to do is work that's sort of more on the prevention side of things. So kind of like on the education side of things, like how do we get people the information, the perspectives, and the support that they need to really be able to interrogate a lot of really kind of icky ideas that a lot of us kind of, for lack of academic words, just kind of icky ideas that we all absorb about gender in the world and our place in it, and our ability to actually have agency to impact how others think about gender. So what I did for a long time is I ran a youth leadership program at a nonprofit in Oakland. We mostly worked with immigrant youth, youth of color, young people who are coming from poor and working class families, folks who are often kind of described as the communities where there's like the most violence, right? If we think about it in these really problematic ways that we tell stories about which kinds of people are violent. And, in working with primarily like middle school and high school youth leaders, we developed together sort of a curriculum, a way for them to bring these conversations about gender, about patriarchy, about racism, about immigrant oppression, about domestic violence, about, sexual harassment, about consent, about ways to negotiate conflict, how they could bring all of that stuff to their peer communities, but also to their parents and to their families, who are people who also haven't received this kinds of education. I find myself often in situations where I'm teaching people things that I've never been taught myself, right? And that requires that I engage in that practice really dynamically with learners, because we're all learning together. I'm learning how to teach it and they're learning it for the first time. Other work that I've done is very similar types of peer educator training projects at places like UC Berkeley, or also in partnership with grassroots community organizations. So I've worked with people on these topics anywhere between the ages of about 10 and 80 years old. So I tend to believe that everybody comes in with knowledge about topics of gender and harm and identity. And yeah, so that's a little bit about the work that I've done, and I've been really blessed to be able to do that work in communities of people that have, just taught me a whole lot about how to do this work in a generous way, but in a way that really kind of calls everyone into the best version of themselves, so that together we can, take some of those really challenging steps forward to identify what are some of the changes we need to make in our institutions, in our relationships, and in ourselves to be able to address gender, and in particular, manifestations of masculinity that can be really problematic, but also manifestations of masculinity that can be really beautiful and really caring and really loving. And so, that's kind of a little bit of my kind of professional background and how I came into this work. Just a note about me is I spent probably about the first 25 years of my life walking through this world as a woman appearing person. And then I spent another handful of years walking around looking very androgynous. And it's only been in about the past 7 to 8 years that I've kind of walked around looking like this. And within that experience, I've spent time in all women's spaces. I've spent time in all men's spaces. I've spent time in all trans spaces, straight spaces, mixed spaces, queer spaces. I've been able to hear people talk about these things from so many different perspectives when they think they're in, kind of identity-based company, right? So kind of when people feel like they're in their safe spaces where they can, take their masks off and say what they really think about things, especially really sensitive things like gender and masculinity and relationships and violence that they've either experienced or committed. And, from that perspective, especially being someone who grew up as, a young girl, a young queer person, I came into my political consciousness in feminist spaces. I found that, part of this work that I've done, which a lot of it has been with boys and young men and adult men, is really realizing how humanizing this work needs to be of everybody who participates in it. Right? And how important that is that we approach it with that lens. And so, I kind of want to, that's enough about me. I kind of want to talk a little bit more about, just an overview of the course and some of the priorities that I have. So, there are lots of different ways that people can approach teaching masculinity studies. Ironically, the one gender studies class that I took when I was an undergraduate was a class on men and masculinities, plural, and the professor really reminded us at every moment that this thing that we call masculinity is incredibly plural, right? And at the same time that we recognize that it's really plural, we also have to recognize that there are dominant forms of it that kind of set certain standards against which other masculinities are measured. And that has effects. That has effects on the people who embody that dominant masculinity, right? That has effects on how institutions are shaped through that dominant masculinity. And that also affects how people who aren't of dominant masculinities experience themselves and experience grief and harm and violence. And so, you know, the way that I approach this class is really through a feminist pedagogical perspective. And so what I mean when I say that, because again, like one thing we're going to explore throughout the class is the way that each of us may think we use words in ways that other people instantly understand, right? The word masculinity is used so commonly. The word feminism is used so commonly, and we hear it based on our own lives and our own understanding. We fill it with our own meanings, right? That's natural. I think that's really just a thing that people do. And in this class, we're going to realize that, you know, your definition and your definition, they might kind of butt heads. And how do we sort of engage with those different definitions respectfully while also coming to shared language and shared understanding for how we can actually talk with one another and not just kind of like talk past one another. Create shared terms for discussion and shared, you know, practices of engaging with one another is going to be super important. And to really kind of like go deeper than some of the headlines and some of the talking points that are out there, I think that, you know, once certain issues, especially things like, you know, Me Too or, you know, conversations about toxic masculinity, you know, once those hit the mainstream, they kind of take on a life of their own. And we think that because we've heard these things so often that we know all about them. We might know a whole bunch. And there's also a lot beneath those surfaces of things that have appeared to us, you know, in our worlds. And so, you know, part of this course, I really want to encourage us to enter with a lot of curiosity about things that we already feel like we know a lot about, right? Because one of the things that I think is important throughout this course is, you know, having critical conversations about masculinity necessarily involves questioning the way institutions, classrooms, syllabi, grading, the way all of these things are infused with sort of like hierarchy, right? Hierarchy is a big part of masculinity and patriarchy. And so interrogating the way that that shows up in everything that we do, right? Which means sort of like approaching this content, even for myself, with a lot of humility and curiosity, even though this is something I've been, you know, hired to teach this class because folks, for one reason or another, thought that I had enough knowledge to be able to share with others. It also requires that I come in with large degrees of humility and curiosity, understanding that there are going to be other people in this course who are going to have experiences with gender and masculinity that are very different from mine. And so, you know, so that's kind of like my approach to pedagogy. And that's just kind of like a little tiny snapshot. You know, I could talk about like pedagogy, queer pedagogy, feminist pedagogy, all that kind of stuff for a really, really long time. But I don't have that time. But if you want to hear more about it, I'd be happy to share that in the class, especially like queer and feminist pedagogies in relation to talking about masculinity. How does that work, right? What's the place for, you know, cisgender people, right? Folks who aren't trans. What's the place for those people in those kinds of pedagogies? What's the place of, you know, transmasculine people or trans men in those? What's the place for straight people in those conversations? And I think that that's what's really exciting to me is finding a place for everyone in these conversations and also creating that shared language and shared framework so that we can talk about these different understandings and experiences of gender and masculinity. And so I think because of that, one thing that's going to be really important is for us to understand a little bit of the context around dominant masculinities in the United States, right? So it's going to mean talking about, you know, these things in really intersectional ways, right? We're going to need to talk about, you know, colonization, white supremacy, immigration. We're going to have to talk about slavery. We're going to have to talk about the ways that our ideas of masculinity are really intensely shaped by race and class and body. You know, we're going to have to talk about how all of that operates within family and kinship and community networks. You know, we're going to have to talk about how all of this stuff intersects with sexuality, you know, and gender, right? Is everyone who is received in the world as masculine, do they self-identify as masculine? Does everyone who feels that masculinity lives within them feel like that masculinity is recognized outside of themselves? You know, these really kind of nitty-gritty things that often kind of like get glossed over when we assume that everyone is talking about the same thing when we say masculinity. I also think it's going to be really important in this course to make sure that we're holding ourselves to our highest expectations when we talk about issues of violence, right? And in that interest, I think it's going to be important for us to talk about masculinity and violence, both when it comes to masculine folks being, people who are doing harm, right? What we commonly call like perpetrators of violence, but people who are harmful to others and themselves. But also in that vein, thinking about masculine people who experience harm and experience violence, right? And talking a lot about cycles of violence in our communities and in our cultures. But I also really want there to be a large piece around, the way that masculinity links to senses of responsibility and to healing. Because, one thing that I see that is, just a really important thing in this current moment is that it's very clear to me that all kinds of folks who embody all kinds of masculinities need healing, right? Because there's a certain woundedness, right? There's a right way to do masculinity and there's a wrong way to do masculinity, and that shifts across contexts based on who's sort of assessing people. And so I think that, maybe right now what I'll do is I'll kind of segue into talking about the Masc You Live In film, and I hope that folks were able to watch it. If you weren't able to watch it, maybe there are some things that I'll talk about in these next few minutes that will spark your interest. But I think what is really exciting to me about that film is in just 90 minutes, they're able to talk about so many things, right? And it just makes me really excited for the fact that, that's just one sort of like 90-minute documentary film. We're going to be using, other documentary films, current events, fiction, poetry, academic articles, all different types of media, to find different entry points so that we make sure that all these different perspectives are present in the classroom. And what really excites me about the Masc You Live In is how much it focuses on the importance of rites of passage for young men and masculine people, and how important that is. And that for so many of us, coming from so many different communities and cultures, is that our rites of passage have been taken away, right? And through rites of passage being taken away, masculine people are often left in this void of self-actualization, right? So what happens is people don't like to have voids left behind, so those voids get filled. Oftentimes in our culture, the only rites of passage that, masculine folks are left with are, the military, right? Violent sports, fraternities, gangs, other forms of violence, other competitive enterprises. And so, what could different rites of passage look like? And I think the film really explores some different ways that young men and masculine people can come into a really secure sense of themselves, instead of sort of using violence and other people's bodies to secure that sense of gender. And I think another really exciting thing about the film is that piece that I mentioned earlier around humanization, right? I think that, one thing that I've learned now that I've spent, good several years walking through the world looking like some version of a man person is that I had spent a lot of time with a lot of really dehumanizing ideas about men and masculine people, ideas that I use to judge other people, ideas that I use to judge myself, ideas that kept me from, really kind of like living the politics that I held very deeply. But when it came to issues of men and masculinity, all of a sudden, my compassion would kind of hit a wall. But, spending more time with young men and adolescents and adult men, having more of these vulnerable conversations when they feel like they're in safe places is I've come to realize that for me, part of my own healing as a feminist, as a queer and a trans person who's often been the target of these forms of harm is that, there's a lot of pain and a lot of harm that men and masculine people do to one another that they kind of get stuck on and then aren't able to look beyond that own experience and get these kind of horse blinders around their own experience. And part of what I'm able to do now in those spaces is to offer those reflections kind of like as this insider outsider, but because of how I look and the packaging I now come in, I'm heard and received differently. And so I try to kind of be a bridge between lots of different spaces and lots of different, kind of ways of thinking about these things. And I think that, those are really kind of two of the biggest pieces that I take from that film. And so, if you haven't seen the film, if you haven't if you haven't had the opportunity to do that, I highly recommend it. It doesn't touch on everything, right? Not even close, right? There's just sort of like a little conversation about queerness. There's nothing in there about, you know, transness or gender identity. You know, there's a little bit in there about, you know, immigrant experiences, you know, but there's just so much more that we're going to be able to get into with sort of like a full semester length class. I'm seeing a question because I've kind of like said all the things that I had really wanted to get across, but at this point, I really want to make sure that I turn it over to anyone who has their own reflections from having watched the film or has questions about what this class can be. What are we going to talk about? What is that going to look like? How are you going to, you know, create? Here's a question here. How do you create safe space in your class to address divergent views? That's a really great question. So one of the things that I do and will do with this class is to create group agreements, like right from jump, right? So right from the get-go, you know, we're going to get in there and we're going to develop sort of, we're all going to collectively answer the question, like, what makes you feel safe in a group discussion, right? What makes you feel safe to be honest? What makes you feel safe to be yourself in a group discussion where there are multiple views, right? And so together we're actually going to like right from the beginning is set those norms for ourselves. And I know there are a lot of places where people set group agreements, but I think one of the things that will be really useful in this class as a practice is actually finding respectful ways to hold ourselves and one another accountable to those group agreements, you know, and also like not just making it about sort of like me as instructor, like I'm sort of like, you know, the head of the classroom, the person who is responsible for calling everyone out, but how do we create a community where we are sort of calling one another in to those group agreements that we will be collectively setting in the beginning, you know, things like, you know, speaking from your own experience, right? We're not going to be able to speak in universals, right? That's also a real kind of like masculinist impulse, is to say that you're the one with the real truth of the matter and that everyone else should think what you think. I find myself in many situations where I think that everybody should think what I think about these things, but I'm time and again proven wrong, that there are other perspectives that are incredibly valuable. And I found that, you know, even airing out problematic perspectives in a way where we ask really challenging questions of problematic perspectives, not to shut them down, but to engage them so that maybe those perspectives can transform through the process. Because I found, for me, oftentimes I've jumped to a lot of assumptions about what I thought people meant when they made a problematic comment. And it just, oftentimes I find out that a person didn't have the language that they needed to articulate something in a way that felt authentic to them. And through asking questions and being curious about problematic comments, that really allows us to kind of like explore them more deeply. And in being asked questions about something problematic a person might say, it gives them an opportunity to actually reflect on what they said and how other people are hearing it, right? So that kind of like dynamic engagement, you know, held in a respectful way. Yeah.
So this is a time for folks to use the question and answer function to both share questions for discussion about the mask you live in, the film, which I'm going to suggest we talk about first, but you can also share questions that you have about WGST 35, Introduction to Masculinity Studies, that Dr. Osborne-Sifuentes will be teaching in fall. So anything that you would like to see covered before we hop off a half hour from now, you're welcome to put into the Q&A function.
Yeah, and just so folks know, like I'm working on the syllabus right now, you know, and so I'm coming up with sort of like the units and the assignment descriptions. So, you know, very rarely do you get the opportunity to talk to, you know, your professor before the class starts and get to have any input about what shows up in that syllabus. So now's your chance, because I'm drafting that currently. So yeah, please, yeah.
So we do have, so the format that we have to take the questions is that you'll type them into the Q&A, and then Adele and I will channel them and read them. So we have one question from a participant. What do you think about the suggestion that boys need male role models? This seems to be an assumption in the film.
Yeah, that definitely, I picked that up in the film too. And I think that, this is a really complicated question. I tend to not be someone who answers like questions with like, yes, I agree with it, or no, I don't agree with it. I think what I'll say about that is that, I think boys and young men need mentors of all genders, like many, many different genders. I would hope that some of those mentors would be, men. I also know that, people who generally find themselves in those kinds of roles, most of the adults who interact with young men on a daily basis because of the gendered labor of parenting, because of gendered labor in schools, is that most of those people already are women. And so I think that that's really interesting to note, but I do think that there can be really strong impacts when there are male role models. I don't think it's 100% necessary. I've known lots of like wonderful men who've grown up sort of like raised almost exclusively by women, and queer people and trans people and non-binary people, and they've turned out to be wonderful people. So I don't think it's 100% necessary, though I will say that I do notice, especially like younger men do, as opposed to like when I appeared as a woman or an androgynous person, I will say that like young men now do listen to me very differently and are drawn to me and very differently in terms of like needing my attention in a certain way. So I know that for some young men that can feel really, really important and can be super impactful. So, I kind of try to think about it where like, yes, idealistically, like you don't have to have a male role model, but some young men for whatever reason have wounds around, male caregivers, or, wounds around peer violence where they could greatly benefit from sort of like, healthy masculine or male role models in their lives. I could say so much about that question, and come to class and I'll say more.
So I just want to share from Eric Greenfrost, who is a professor at City College, also comments that maybe the concept needs to be reframed that boys need models of masculinities, and to acknowledge toxic places they may find those if not presented other alternatives by people of any gender.
Absolutely. That is a beautiful and succinct answer.
Great. And so we have a question from another professor, Tamina Khan. Can you comment on the nuclear family and how it entrenches stereotypical gender roles and isolates us from a multi-generational community?
Yeah, one of the things that's, just really interesting about the history of the United States, particularly in the past like 60 to 70 years, is its kind of single-minded obsession with and privileging of the nuclear family. So what we mean when we say the nuclear family is this kind of standard expectation where there's like one straight dad, one straight mom, and a couple of 2 to 3 kids, right? And that historically has been designed as a model that would actually create gender roles. So the idea was that there would be a dad, and the dad would model gender for the boy child, and there would be a mom, and mom would model gender for a girl child. And so what's really problematic about that is it creates these really intense relationships between parents and children, because for thousands of years, people have lived in multi-generational kinship networks where the flows of care and the modeling, sorry, the dog pushed the door open and is now playing with the squeaky toy, so I have to go close the door real quick. Okay, I'm back. And so, I think that, yeah, nuclear family structures were designed to kind of like put people in these kinds of like isolated units so they could sort of, fester in sometimes really problematic relationships around gender, around violence. And multi-generational kinship networks are there are plenty of powerful contemporary examples for how, people can sort of learn to be in relation to themselves and one another and roles of responsibility very, very differently through those types of things. So I really appreciate that comment, because that's a huge piece around sort of dominant masculinities, is like feeling like you're kind of, king over a nuclear family. And that's part of how it was sort of talked about when that was being promoted.
Maurer, there's a question about from an anonymous attendee about the class. They said, I'm curious if the course would touch upon the effects of toxic masculinity on the development of trans women and femmes, or if that would be outside of the scope of what will be discussed in 35.
Yeah. So here's what I'm gonna say. So I'm gonna give a zoomed out answer to that question, and then I'm gonna give like a specific answer to that question. So my zoomed out answer is mostly in relation to this part that says, you know, would this be outside of the scope of the class? So my general practice is that if like we're talking about something in class and something comes up for just one person, it's not outside of the scope, right? Because whatever we were talking about brought that up for you. So it's clearly related. And, you know, I would be happy to address things like this in the context of this course, because I do think that, you know, I have a lot of follow-up questions. You know, I'm curious about, you know, the effects of toxic masculinity on the development of trans women and femmes. Like, you know, I would just be curious to hear more about, you know, like the impacts of sort of like, you know, violence from masculine people towards trans women or femmes, or is this a question about, you know, how toxic masculinity is, you know, because many people who, you know, at some point in life identify as trans women or femmes, you know, many of them sort of grow up sort of like being socialized as little boys or young men. And so I assume that masculinity or being taught masculinity is a part of that, you know, process of life development. You know, I anticipate that that might be a part of that experience that a person would have to kind of like contend with in that process of sort of coming into a different sense of gender throughout life. Yeah, so I have a lot of questions about sort of like, you know, more questions about that question, but that's kind of like my broad answer is definitely not outside of the scope.
And so a couple comments, one from an anonymous attendee who wants to suggest Peggy Orenstein's book, Boys and Sex, as extremely relevant to these topics and maybe interesting to add to the syllabus.
Yeah.
I think that would be one of my students. Thank you for that. I see some great questions about the course overall that I'd like to save till the end. But we have a question from Professor Beatriz Herrera. I can feel your passion on this topic through the Zoom screen. Have you found in conversations with young men of color that men of color actually subvert gender stereotypes about their own masculinity in key ways? If so, what have you experienced?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I mean, yes, like, you know, so definitely I can say yes. I think that, you know, one thing that's really interesting is, you know, questions like this for me are kind of like easier to answer in anecdote format. So I'll do that it's sort of like as briefly as I can. And I found that, you know, the category of young men of color is so diverse and so rich, and that I've had the good fortune of working with people from so many different kinds of communities. And I think one of the most interesting sort of communities that I was able to work in was one in East Oakland in a middle school where there were, it was predominantly like Latinx young people, you know, Black African-American young people, and then also Pacific Islander young folks. And I think one thing that was just really interesting for me is that, you know, the Pacific Islander boys tended to be sort of like, they were tall. Many of them sort of like were really athletic and played football, like very muscular young men. And, you know, they were kind of like seen as very like, you know, you don't mess with those kids. Like, you know, they're much bigger than most of the other kids around them. And they also like, many of them were cousins. And so they often kind of like went around in larger groups. And so oftentimes when you see that type of like physicality and stature and, you know, lots of like, you know, young boys who are already like really tall and muscular walking around, lots of people kind of like have all these really interesting assumptions. And at the same time, you know, from my time, you know, hanging out with Pacific Islander folks is like teachers, elders, adults, like those are people that you respect like no one else, right? And so it would be really, really interesting to see lots of other young men kind of look to these boys when they were in class with me, because they would be, you know, super respectful, like always following instructions, you know, like, you know, would engage with me in really dynamic and interesting ways. And at the same time, you know, their peers were kind of like used to them being sort of like the tough guys out on the playground, you know, who like nobody messed with them. And then to see them be deferent to me really kind of like created this really interesting multiplicity and complexity around how like in different cultural spaces, like precisely, you know, these questions about, you know, stereotypes around gender and masculinity is like, I saw so many different groups of young men of color just really kind of like mess with these really like static and rigid ideas that people have about them. Yeah, I don't know if that's like a helpful illustration of how I think about these things.
So there's a question from, am I muted? No.
No.
Okay, great. There's a question from Oksana Filichinka. Do you find a link between the masculine mask and the historic necessity of countries to take part in wars? Can military people get rid of this mask ever?
Yeah, gosh, I mean, this is a huge question. This is something that, you know, I think about a lot, because I think, you know, one of the ways that I have come to understand like dominant masculinity in the United States is that it's very much like a military masculinity. You know, this kind of like toxic masculinity is just sort of like civilianized military masculinity, where it's like very hierarchical, you know, very geared towards, you know, domination. You know, it's not much about sort of like negotiation and diplomacy and vulnerability skills. And so it's, wait, where did that question go? Oh, sorry, I was reading it.
Shall I read it again?
Yeah, I read it.
The one from Oksana.
Yeah.
Do you find a link between the masculine mask and the historic necessity of countries to take part in wars?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think the what we call toxic masculinity is like the civilian version of sort of like an aggressive military masculinity. I see those things as very, very linked. And what was the second part of the question?
It was, can military people get rid of the mask ever? So what I'm hearing that there are two levels. There's the societal, institutional level of our engagement with dominant military control, right? Physical military force. And then there's the individual participants of military people, the individuals who are engaged, and can they take their mask off?
Yeah, you know, this is a really interesting question, you know, especially for me, because, you know, one thing that a lot of folks, you know, may not know is that transgender people are twice as likely to serve in the military as non-trans or cisgender people, which means that there are a lot of transgender veterans out there. And, you know, I've been in conversation with some folks who are transgender veterans, you know, just because of the circles that I tend to run in, is they tend to be more like trans men, more trans masculine people, but that for them, you know, the military was a way to kind of consolidate their sense of gender, right? And that they found that to be true for lots of other men and queer and masculine people in the military, and that sort of coming out of the military and dealing with sort of like, you know, the gender dysphoria that comes from being out of the military, but also how that is layered in complex ways with sort of like having trans identities or, you know, like differently gendered identities. And that, you know, that process of healing and taking off that mask is really hard. And, you know, because they have friends who are veterans of many genders, you know, how they talk about how, you know, they see how difficult the taking off of that mask is and returning to civilian life. And how it's also like even more complex for them because their sense of their gender identity was really solidified in that military. So it's kind of like these multiple layers of taking off masks, but still feeling like yourself at the same time, and finding through that sort of like, well, then who am I? You know, and the kind of support that people need to be able to go through those processes is just, I think it's really important work, you know, like healing folks who have been forced into violence in some ways.
And so I have the next question for you, Mauro, but I just wanted to say too that, you know, a lot of my background is in working with veterans, and that we have a large number of veterans that take classes in women's and gender studies at college. And I think in one of my courses, which is part of the Trauma Prevention and Recovery Certificate, have in particular had a large number of veterans and have been really grateful for their insight from, you know, veterans of all genders. But the men who have been in my classes who are veterans have been at the forefront of calling for the need for this course and for more dedicated space to think through these issues, and have had some of the most sophisticated, erudite reflections on masculinity and masculine socialization that they really enriched our classes.
Yeah, and those are some things that I'm really excited to engage, because I think like there are lots of us like civilian folk who have like lots of thoughts and opinions and analyses about the military and masculinity and violence. And then, you know, where the rubber hits the road is that most of us have never experienced that firsthand. And there are lots of folks who like don't actually know very many veterans or active duty, you know, service people. And so I think that, you know, it's really important because, you know, the US military is the largest organization in the entire world, you know, like that's just a fact of the matter, both in terms of like personnel and in terms of like global reach. So this is sort of like an entity that shapes so much. And so to exclude, you know, the perspectives of folks who have more experience within that institution, I think would just be a hugely missed opportunity, both to like, yeah, just hear lots of different perspectives and also just sort of understand, you know, more about what that experience is. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a comment and a question from Tamina Khan. I'm really excited for this class. I teach bell hooks all about love in my English comp class and find that young men in particular connect deeply with our discussion of love and longing for a space to explore masculinity and love. And then from an anonymous attendee, hopefully a prospective student, what are your goals in teaching this class? Like, what are some of the takeaways for students?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So some of the takeaways for students is, one of them is just really simple. And one of them is, how can we practice and demonstrate having conversations from lots of different perspectives and life experiences and like have that not go horribly wrong? That's kind of like one of my primary goals, you know, because I think so many of us have so many charged feelings, right, about talking about these issues of masculinity and men, you know, in the context of, you know, gender and feminism. And, you know, it can be really hard to just get folks to feel safe enough to be able to speak honestly, right, and to disagree respectfully and to ask critical and curious questions of one another. So one of my huge goals is to just have us get really good at doing that with one another, right? Asking like curious questions and holding one another accountable and being really, just really curious about the diversity that's in that classroom. Another goal is sort of, you know, I'm really curious to learn all the different reasons that people are finding themselves in this class. As I'm developing the syllabus, I'm thinking about how to kind of design assignments that aren't just sort of like standalone assignments, but that they're building towards something over the course of the semester, right? And so what I hope we will be building towards is that people will have the opportunity to explore a topic around, you know, masculinity that is of deep interest to them. And through that exploration, you know, doing research and connecting readings to this thing that they're thinking through, to also think about, like, towards the end of the class, you know, from what we talk about in the class, from the reading and the research that people do on their own, like, what are some sort of entry points that folks see to begin to shift things in communities that they already participate in or communities they want to begin to participate in, right? So one of my goals is this kind of like this balance between sort of like, you know, theoretical learning and conversations, but also like, you know, living in the world as people who possibly want to be social change agents, right? So how can we bring our learning into the worlds and the spaces that mean the most to us? So I would say those are kind of two of my biggest goals, is, yeah, taking some steps towards that.
Mauro, there's a question that's come in from Adama Williams. I'm a single Black mother that has raised my son in a single mother household.
Yeah.
Due to that, my son loves watching Disney movies and romance. So
Yeah.
he just asked, was he a normal man? Will you be able to tear down these stereotypes?
Yeah, it's really interesting to me, this word normal. I've been thinking about this word so much recently. Yeah, anyway. But what I'll say about normal is that one thing that I kind of like try to like parse out is, the way the word normal operates in really different ways, right? And obviously, like, you might not be able to have this conversation with a young boy, but there are ways that you could kind of communicate this, is that, normal gets used in one way, right, to just kind of talk about like what most people do, right? So it's kind of like a statistical reference point. So like, okay, most people do this thing, right? But normal also operates in another kind of insidious way, in this kind of like policing, disciplinary kind of way, where like when we're talking about normal, we find that we're really talking about like what's okay, what's privileged, what's natural, what's okay. And so when I think about it in those two ways, like, yeah, it may be the case that, a boy or a young man likes doing things that many other boys aren't into. Maybe those other boys aren't into that thing because of that kind of like policing norm that keeps them from fully exploring all the things that they might be interested in, And so I think that, I think that that's a really powerful question. I think that's really important. And I've known lots of amazing people who were raised by single mothers who, have developed a broader repertoire of things that they're aware of in the world than most boys who don't grow up around that kind of influence. And I think that that's a really important thing for young men to see as a strength, and, to develop resilience around, the kind of like teasing and policing that may come from other boys and other women and girls and other genders as well. So yeah, we all unfortunately internalize a lot of that stuff, and it gets played out. But yeah, I think that's a really important question. And yeah, I think something worth exploring more deeply, and something that, I used to have to think about on a daily basis working in middle schools with students. Yeah.
Okay, so we're ending or nearing the end of our time, but I'd like to share one more question, and I want to acknowledge we're not going to get to every question here, but one more question about kind of content, and then a few questions about the course. We have a question from Eric Greenfrost. I've heard there are political and maybe pedagogical considerations with the term toxic masculinity, including those who identify as feminists but are against using it. I'm not sure I totally understand the arguments. Will the class be exploring that topic at all, and what are your thoughts on the matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm familiar with the phrase toxic masculinity. I've been around it a whole bunch. It's not one that I use because for a number of different reasons, because I think that it glosses over stuff that we kind of need to dive into more deeply. Like, what do we mean when we say toxic, right? And also thinking about, how these terms like toxic masculinity or hyper masculinity, who tends to be sort of like the target of those labels. I think it's really important that we think about questions of class, questions of race, cultural questions. And so, I think that toxic masculinity is an understandable shorthand that many people use in the absence of having spaces to think about these things more deeply. And so, necessarily because it's something that's kind of like in the ether and is a term that gets used a whole bunch, I think we're going to have to address it, and we're going to have to figure out how we want to navigate terms together. I'm not someone who is like, you can say this and you can't say that, but I will tell people how I relate to that language and why I relate to it that way. And, we're going to have to figure out how to do that together in a way where we're not like policing one another's language to the point where people are afraid to speak, right? But also being really mindful of the language that we use. So yeah, that's what I'll say about that.
Adele, did you I heard you say you had a follow-up question?
Sure, I think we have time for one more question. So Jennifer Hightower asks, a lot of conversations around masculinity seem to be geared towards creating a safe environment for boys to come into their own masculinity that isn't toxic. what would be strategies for pushing back on toxic masculinity in spaces that are more so for adults, yet and have experienced decades of conditioning?
Oh my gosh, this is really hard. So I'm gonna be honest, like there's a reason that I for a long time worked more with middle school and high school and undergraduate than with sort of like older adults. I think one thing that is really helpful in contexts like that is you know, finding like men who are sort of like more open to thinking about these things, because what I have found is that in group contexts, right, like especially contexts with adults, is that even just one man kind of doing things differently or intervening or, you know, creating more room for other genders to speak and fill space can go a really long way. So you know, that's it. Yeah, it's a super complex question and something that I think a whole bunch about, and it's a lot more challenging than working with younger people. But I do think sort of like the ally approach and finding like one person who might be open to hearing like what a space is like for other genders to be in it, and really finding someone who's able to listen. And yeah, because even just one person can make a big difference in intervening on those things. But I'm happy to talk about that more in our Canvas messages, Jennifer.
So there are so many excellent questions here, and I'm sad that we can't get to all of them, but thank you all very much for your really excellent questions and engagement. I want to acknowledge there was a question from an anonymous attendee. I'm curious if Masculinity Studies may have its own version of Project Survive, akin to how Tulai has the Pinoys to Men support group, except with peer education, like what was done in Feminist on Cell Block Y. And I can take that one and just say that leadership development for gender justice, for healthy relationships, against interpersonal violence is absolutely at the center of how we want to think about our work in the Women's and Gender Studies Department. And I don't have an answer to this question yet, but it is something that we've been hearing from students they're very interested in. And that Project Survive has a club, which tends to be a really great kind of engine for student ideas and also an incubator of student ideas. And so if students are interested in seeing more of this work on campus, besides taking WGST 35 in fall, another way you can get involved is with the Project Survive Student Club, and to think about how students can bring more of more peer education content on these topics to the campus community. And we have a question from Trustee Thea Selby. How can we attract men to this class? And so I want to use that to transition to how can we let people know about this class? What's the outreach plan? How can people here register?
So Maggie, we can't hear you.
I'm mute.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, sorry about that. I was saying, keep going, Adele. I put up the flyer for the course so people could have information about that, because it was related to exactly what you were saying. And now Adele's muted, yes.
Okay, so this is our course flyer, and I'll put in the chat, but we have an interest survey for people who are interested in enrolling. Of course, you know, many of you already have registration appointments coming up, but if there are people that you'd like to share the news about this course with, you can send them to the interest survey, and then we'll be able to follow up with them if they have any questions about enrolling. But if there are other ideas about ways we should get the word out about this course, and particularly addressing Trustee Selby's question of how to attract men to the course, happy to hear ideas from other folks as well.
And so I'm attentive to the time and want to thank everyone for so many great questions and comments. That's very exciting to see this. We will be sharing the video of the webinar, and we want to figure out a way to enlist Dr. Osborne-Sifuentes in answering and responding to some of the additional questions that we just didn't have time for, and to make those available to everyone.
Yeah, I'd be happy to respond in writing or in like a Zoom video recorded format. I don't know if people are like a fan of like seeing me wave my hands around and like stare in lots of different directions. So if it's better that I just respond in writing, I can do that. And if you like watching me wave my hands around, then register for the class.
That sounds great, Mauro. Either one, we'll figure it out afterwards, and that will be available on the Women's and Gender Studies website.
Great.
So thank you everyone for coming, and I hope you'll register for the class. May 11th, we expect the schedule to go live, and so the CRN is. We've shared that with you, and I hope you'll be able to find the class and register for it, and tell all your friends about it too.
Yeah, thank you all so much for letting me chat with folks. I'm a little interaction deprived, so it was really great to hear so many questions from so many people. Really exciting.
Thank you, Mauro.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Everybody.
And one final thing, I need to thank our partner, Susan Bachman and Broadcast Media, and also our partners in the library have been fantastic advocates for our work, but also a real help to make this webinar possible. So thank you to Michelle McKenzie as well. So Susan and Michelle, thank you.
Yeah, thank you both so much.
Thanks to Master Gonzalez for joining too.